There's a house at the end of a long dirt road in North Carolina. Most people pass by without noticing it. But inside that house, something happened. Something no one could explain. Not at first. One summer, a little girl vanished from the life she knew. No Amber Alert, no breaking news headlines, just silence. Until the day someone finally made a phone call that couldn't be ignored. It was too late, but only just. The stories began to unravel. Stories from a hospital room, from a courtroom, from people who swore they never saw the signs, and from one person who saw everything, but didn't speak until it was over. This isn't a story about strangers or monsters lurking in the dark. It's about something much closer, something far more difficult to look at, a question that still haunts everyone involved. How could this happen when someone should have been watching? This is not the story they wanted told, but it's the one that needs to be. And this is the story they'll never forget. Before anything else, before the news stories, before the courtroom, before the whispers, there was just a little girl, and her name was Teghan. Teghan Skiba was born in North Carolina in the summer of 2005, a spark of light in a complicated world. Just 4 years old when she was last seen by her daycare teachers. But even in those 4 short years, she made herself unforgettable. Teghan was the kind of child who didn't just smile, she beamed. She liked storybooks about animals, hummed while coloring, and wore mismatched socks because she thought it was funny. Her favorite toy was a stuffed giraffe, worn soft from being carried everywhere, even to bed. One daycare worker later described her as a little chatterbox with bright eyes and a world of imagination. She would talk about everything. The clouds, her dreams, a puppy she wanted, a princess dress she'd seen in a store window. But Teghan's world wasn't perfect. Her mother, Helen Reyes, was doing what so many young mothers try to do: survive. She was a single parent, balancing work and the demands of military training. There were no headlines when Helen dropped her daughter off at daycare in the mornings. No one wrote news stories about her long shifts, the fast food dinners, the quiet rides home in an old car that sometimes wouldn't start. But it was in those everyday moments that their bond was strongest. Teghan would sit on the kitchen counter while Helen made sandwiches. They would sing together in the car. There was love in that house, even if it sometimes came in tired, overworked silence. But Helen didn't have a strong support system. Teghan's father was absent, not just physically, but emotionally, financially, and legally. There were no grandparents around the corner. No nearby aunts or uncles to babysit when the days got long. And that was where Jonathan Richardson came in. A boyfriend. Not Teghan's father, not her legal guardian. Just someone Helen had been seeing for a short while. To some, he seemed quiet, maybe awkward, but not dangerous. And in a moment where she felt out of options, preparing for an out-of-town military training assignment, Helen made a decision. One that, years later, she would describe as the worst choice of her life. For 10 days, Helen would be gone. 10 days that were supposed to be temporary. 10 days that would stretch into history and into horror. Teghan had no idea. She was 4. She didn't understand fear like adults do. She packed her giraffe, a toothbrush, and a coloring book. She didn't know that behind the door she walked through was a man hiding more than just silence. What happened next would shake a community. It would raise questions that still haven't been answered, and it would lead to one of the most difficult trials the region had ever seen. But before we get to any of that, we need to understand who she was, not just as a name in a headline, but as a child, as a life, as a light. Teghan Skiba was left behind, but she will not be forgotten. Long before the headlines, before the investigators, the courtrooms, and the impossible grief, there was Helen. Not a name you'd recognize unless you'd followed the case closely, but her story is where the cracks began to form. Helen Reyes grew up in rural North Carolina. Her childhood was not defined by comfort, but by resilience. In a town where opportunity was rare and expectations were quiet, Helen was one of the few who wanted more. She joined the military straight out of high school, not out of pride or tradition, but survival. She needed a way out, a way forward, something steady, something she could build on. In her own words later, she said, "It wasn't about ambition. It was about not drowning." She was still young when she became a mother. Teghan was born during a time when everything felt like it was slipping: finances, relationships, and her sense of control. Teghan's father was never in the picture. Not really. A name on paper, a moment in time, a shadow that never turned into support. Helen raised Teghan alone, juggling part-time jobs, deployment rotations, and sleepless nights. And while she tried, genuinely, endlessly tried, she was also tired. Chronically. Quietly. The kind of tired that doesn't show up in photographs but settles in your bones. She met Jonathan Richardson in the quiet spaces between survival. A new face, a change in routine, a conversation that didn't demand much. At first he was nothing unusual: a few shared meals, long phone calls, someone who listened when she needed to vent. He offered rides, watched Teghan while she ran errands, said the right things at the right times. For someone drowning in exhaustion, Jonathan didn't look like a red flag. He looked like a life raft. But over time, things began to shift, in ways that weren't loud, but slow. Jonathan would comment on her choices, correct her gently in public, suggest that certain friends weren't good influences, that the daycare wasn't safe enough, that she worked too much, that Teghan needed more structure. It didn't feel like control, it felt like concern, like someone finally paying attention to all the invisible weight she'd been carrying alone. Looking back, she would admit that there were signs. But in the moment, she was just trying to breathe. By the time the military orders came through, a temporary training assignment in another state, Helen felt she had no choice. Teghan couldn't come with her, daycare wasn't an option, and Jonathan had offered. "Just 10 days, she reportedly said. "I'll call every day. I'll be right back." In Helen's world, this wasn't recklessness. It was logistics. A mother doing what she thought she had to do. Under pressure, in a hurry, trusting the wrong person. That trust would cost everything. In the aftermath, Helen Reyes became a name in headlines. A name with weight, with consequence. But behind the transcripts and the public opinion was a woman who made a choice. One she can't take back. A mother not of malice, but of exhaustion, of desperation, of trusting someone she didn't yet fully understand. And by the time she did, her daughter was already gone. Some stories don't begin with monsters. They begin with silence, with overlooked warning signs, small fractures in someone's spirit, and a world that never asked why. Jonathan Douglas Richardson didn't grow up in the kind of environment where empathy was taught. Born into instability, surrounded by inconsistency, his early years were marked by volatility that left lasting, invisible scars. Those close to him later described a household steeped in unpredictability, not always outwardly violent, but often cold, emotionally barren, the kind of upbringing where children learn not to cry because no one is listening. As a teenager, Jonathan's behavior began to shift. He grew quiet, then withdrawn, then unpredictable. He struggled with school, clashed with authority, and displayed patterns of control that, at the time, looked like mood swings. But there was more. His temper wasn't just reactive, it was methodical. Teachers noted how quickly frustration turned into shutdown. Friends, the few he had, said there were moments when he seemed almost detached from reality. And yet, he moved through life unnoticed. By the time he met Helen Reyes, Jonathan was in his early 20s, unemployed, living with extended family, quiet, polite, hard to read. Helen was working 2 jobs. She didn't have the energy to decode someone's subtle darkness. And at first he was helpful, present. He played with Teghan, offered to cook, stayed quiet when others were loud. But over time, the quiet turned cold. Jonathan's comments began to cut deeper. His opinions became rules. He didn't shout, he shut down. He didn't storm off, he disappeared. And when Helen challenged him, he made her feel guilty for working too much, for being tired, for not being enough. Those closest to the couple started noticing strange behaviors. Jonathan didn't like visitors. He kept the blinds closed, the doors locked, the phone on silent. One relative later testified that Teghan seemed nervous when Jonathan entered the room, but no one pressed further. No one intervened. The signs were there, but they were brushed off as personality quirks, as stress, as a young man still finding himself. And then came the assignment. Helen had to leave for military training, just for 10 days. She asked him to watch her daughter. He said yes. Behind closed doors, Jonathan Richardson became something else entirely, something neither Helen nor the system had ever truly seen, but others had sensed it. Whispers at the edge of family conversations, quiet doubts never voiced aloud, neighbors who noticed too much quiet, friends who said, "He always gave me a bad feeling." And in the end, those whispers were too late. Monsters rarely look like monsters at first. Sometimes they wear politeness like a mask. Sometimes they know exactly how to hide. But the consequences of ignoring them are always loud. The house sat on a quiet road, a place where the world should have felt still, safe even. But inside, time moved differently. And for 10 days, it barely moved at all. When Helen Reyes left for military duty, she believed her daughter was in capable hands. She believed there would be structure, meals, rest, laughter, maybe even bedtime stories. What Teghan received instead was silence. On the first day, Teghan was seen outside for a moment. A neighbor would later recall a fleeting glance. A child near the steps, unsmiling. After that, no more sightings. On day 2 to 3, Teghan, once animated and talkative, became quiet, a change that couldn't be seen from the outside, but one that, in retrospect, echoed loudly. She wasn't taken outside. No calls were made to friends, no play, no sound, just the steady hum of a television behind locked doors. On day 4 to 6, no signs of schoolwork, no contact with family. Days passed. The house remained still. Jonathan Richardson told no one how Teghan was doing. Inside, something was shifting. Not suddenly, but slowly. Like a temperature drop you only notice once it's too cold to move. On day 7, something happened on this day. We may never know exactly what, but what is known is that Teghan's condition visibly changed. She stopped moving as much. She stopped responding. Still, no help was called. Not yet. Day 8 to 9. Richardson reportedly tried to manage the situation himself. He didn't call 911, didn't drive to a neighbor's. He stayed inside. By day 9, Teghan was unresponsive for long stretches. Her breathing was faint, her body silent. And then, finally, on the 10th day, Jonathan placed Teghan in his car. He drove her to the nearest hospital. Staff at the ER would later describe the moment as unnerving. A grown man walked in, carrying a child who didn't move, and his story didn't make sense. He told doctors it was an accident, that she had fallen, that he wasn't sure what had happened. But Teghan's injuries told a different story, and within minutes, emergency staff made a call, not just to trauma specialists, but to law enforcement. For 10 days, time moved strangely inside that house. But in that final hour, everything began to move fast. Too fast to reverse. The emergency room staff did their best. They tried to stabilize her. But even as they worked, a sense of unease settled over the room. Something was off. And it wasn't just the child in front of them. It was the man who brought her in. Jonathan Richardson. When questioned, Jonathan's responses didn't add up. He first claimed Teghan had fallen. Then he said she'd been acting strangely the day before, but he didn't know why. His story changed several times, each detail more vague than the last. At one point, he even suggested Teghan might have gotten sick, but never mentioned what that meant. Detectives on the case were quick to notice the inconsistencies. They felt something wasn't right. Richardson's cold demeanor stood in stark contrast to the tragic scene in front of them. Their observations were clear: a man who appeared detached, a man who couldn't or wouldn't explain what had happened to a child in his care. Back at the hospital, the staff struggled to keep composure as they worked. They'd seen emergencies before, but Teghan's condition, so quiet, so still, left even seasoned professionals shaken. One nurse later recalled how she had never felt so helpless. Another described feeling as though they had failed to reach the child in time. Law enforcement gathered everything they could from the house. Everything seemed quiet, ordinary, but that's what made it so unsettling. No signs of struggle, no broken glass, no loud noises, just emptiness. In the moments before their arrival, the house had been frozen in time. Yet what they found, as they combed through, told a different story. In one corner, a child's drawing, crumpled and discarded, a room undisturbed, and a lingering silence that no one could shake. Forensic experts combed through the evidence. What they found was heartbreaking. No signs of an accident, no reasonable explanation for Teghan's condition. Her injuries were severe, and they didn't match Richardson's story. They matched something far darker, something far more sinister. Law enforcement knew that, in the face of what they had uncovered, nothing would ever be the same. Jonathan Richardson had been the last person with Teghan, and his truth was about to unravel. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled, every eye fixed on the man accused of taking a life. But in that room, nothing was certain yet. The trial had begun, and what would come next would decide everything. The district attorney stood tall, addressing the jury. His voice was steady, but every word was weighted with the gravity of what had happened. "You are here," he began, "to seek justice for a child who no longer has a voice, a child whose trust was betrayed in the most unimaginable way." The room fell silent. This was not a case of simple tragedy. This was a case of deliberate cruelty. As the witnesses took the stand, the air in the courtroom grew thick. Family members, law enforcement, and medical staff each described their interactions with Teghan, her innocent smile, her joyful laughter. They all felt the weight of the loss. One by one, they spoke of the child who no longer had the chance to grow up. The medical examiner recounted Teghan's injuries, carefully, without excess detail. But it was clear to all, what happened to her was not an accident. "There was no falling," he said. "This was the result of prolonged neglect and cruelty." Jonathan Richardson sat quietly throughout it all. His expression never changed, stoic, detached. Some in the room tried to understand his silence. Others couldn't help but be disgusted by it. But the truth was, he was already guilty in the eyes of those who mattered most, the people who had loved Teghan. Legal analysts later explained that the evidence was overwhelming. Richardson had no credible defense. He had failed to offer a reasonable explanation for Teghan's injuries, and his actions before and after the incident were damning. The case didn't leave room for doubt. As one legal expert put it, this was a case where the defendant's behavior spoke louder than any statement he could have made. It didn't take long for the jury to return with their decision. Jonathan Richardson was convicted of murder in the first degree. The judge, without hesitation, handed down the sentence: capital punishment. And for Teghan, justice had finally been served. But the hurt of her loss would never be erased. As the trial reached its conclusion, something unexpected came to light. Letters, emotional letters written by Teghan herself, discovered among her belongings after her death. Though she was just a child, these letters held a quiet heartbreak of their own. They were filled with hopes and dreams, simple, innocent wishes that would never come true. One letter written to her mother simply read, "I want to be with you. I'm scared." And as those letters were read aloud in the courtroom, even the most hardened individuals could not hold back their tears. In the end, it wasn't just the case that shook the community. It was the loss of a child, a life cut short before it could even begin. And in the courtroom, Teghan's voice was finally heard. Teghan's story didn't end with the conviction. Her death sparked something far greater. A community shaken to its core rallied in her name, and the consequences of her loss were felt far beyond the courthouse. In the days following the trial, the community gathered. Candles were lit, flowers were left at makeshift memorials. Online tributes poured in from across the world, each one a reminder of what had been lost. Fundraisers were organized, not for those who remained, but for children who could still be saved. It was a turning point, a shift in how people viewed the safety of their own children. As Teghan's story spread, so did a new awareness of the vulnerabilities many children face. Lawmakers took notice. Child protection services reviewed their procedures. Understanding that there were gaps that could have prevented this tragedy, policies were reformed to better address warning signs in caregiver behavior, and new guidelines were introduced to protect children in the care of individuals who were not their biological parents. For Helen Reyes, the aftermath was filled with silence. She retreated from the public eye. In rare interviews, she spoke of her regret, but her words were always tempered by the weight of what she couldn't undo. "I thought I was doing the best I could," she said in one interview, "but in the end, I failed her." The pain of that failure would follow her for the rest of her life. Over time, Teghan became more than just a victim. Her name, her face, her story became part of North Carolina's collective memory. Teghan's death was a catalyst for change. Her legacy lived on in the reforms, the awareness campaigns, and the ongoing work of child advocacy groups who made her story their own. Today, Teghan's story continues to inspire. Advocacy groups use her name to push for stronger child protection laws, educating the public on how to spot signs of abuse before it's too late. Her tragedy serves as a painful reminder, but it also gives us a chance to do better. Her voice, silenced too soon, is now part of the call for action, and through her memory, children across the nation are being protected. Teghan Skiba's life was short, but its impact was profound. Though she may never have known it, her story will never be forgotten. And through the work of those who remember her, her legacy will help protect the innocent for generations to come. Teghan Skiba should have been safe. Her life should have been filled with laughter and light. Not silence, but through telling her story, we honor her name. We push for change, and we say to the world, no more forgotten children. If this story moved you, please share it. Subscribe to help us give voice to the voiceless. Comment below what changes you believe need to happen. Together we remember Teghan, and we protect the next child in danger.